Dear friends, today I'll be talking about colonialism and have titled my lecture Colonialism, Theory and Narrative of Colonial Discourse. The learning objectives of my lecture would be 1. The historical perspective and concept of colonialism. 2. The difference between colonialism and imperialism. 3. Colonialism as a distinctive kind of political ideology. 4. Theory of colonial discourse and the inequitable relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. 5. European literary texts as narratives of the damaging discourse of colonial ideology. And the last, the continuing presence of colonialism in the garb of neocolonialism. I begin with the explication of my first learning objective, which is to understand the historical perspective and concept of colonialism. Colonialism is not a modern phenomenon. World history abounds with examples of one nation extending its rule over a territory beyond its borders and then occupying it and exploiting it economically. In fact, both the Western world and the Eastern world have witnessed a series of empires extending over other territories in the guise of bringing culture and civilization to the subject peoples who were regarded as barbarians. Some of the most famous examples would include the Chinese empires, the Egyptian and Persian empires, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Moors, and the Ottomans. M.A.R. Habib offers a brief historical perspective of the three major phases of colonialism in modern times. He writes, and I quote, "Between 1492 and the mid-18th century, Spain and Portugal, England, France and the Netherlands established colonies and empires in the Americas, the East Indies and India. Then, between the mid-19th century and World War I, there was an immense scramble for imperialistic power between Britain, France, Germany, Italy and other nations. By the end of the 19th century, more than 1/5 of the land area of the world and a quarter of its population had been brought under the British Empire, and this land area included India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Burma and the Sudan. The next largest colonial power was France, whose possessions included Algeria, French West Africa, Equatorial Africa and Indochina. Germany, Italy and Japan also entered the race for colonies. In 1855, Belgium established the Belgian Congo in the heart of Africa. Finally, the periods during and after World War II saw a struggle involving the countries just mentioned as well as conflict between America and the Communist Soviet Union for extended control, power and influence, unquote. The term colonialism has been defined in the Oxford Dictionary as, I quote, "the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically," unquote. Collins English Dictionary defines the term in the following words, I quote, "Colonialism is the practice by which a powerful country directly controls less powerful countries and uses their resources to increase its own power and wealth," unquote. In the light of these two definitions, colonialism, one would say, involves an extension of a nation's rule over a territory beyond its borders and therefore is a practice of domination that involves the subjugation of one people by another. Since the term has gained significance as a specific form of cultural exploitation that developed with the expansion of Europe over the last 400 years, we have Leela Gandhi, the John Hawkes Professor of Humanities at Brown University and a noted academic in the field of post-colonial theory, defining colonialism as, and I quote, "the historical process whereby the West attempts systematically to cancel or negate the cultural difference and value of the non-West." I move on to my second learning objective, which is to understand the difference between colonialism and imperialism. The term colonialism is often used interchangeably with the term imperialism. Therefore, in order to distinguish between the two, it is important that we go to the etymology of both these terms. The term colony has its origin in the Latin word colonus, that means farmer. As such, the practice of colonialism involved the migration of a population to a new territory where these new arrivals lived as permanent settlers but maintained their political allegiance with their home country. Imperialism, however, has its roots in the Latin word imperium, which has various meanings like power, authority, dominion, command, and empire. The word imperialism, therefore, connotes the way one country exercises power over another country. Edward Said offers the following distinction between colonialism and imperialism, I quote, "Imperialism means the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory. Colonialism, which is almost always a consequence of imperialism, is the implanting of settlements on distant territory," unquote. Though both these words underline expression of the other, yet colonialism can be thought to be the practice of a state extending its control beyond its own borders over other states and people, and imperialism as the strategy behind this practice. It is also important to remember that such control is usually not just military but economic and cultural. Moving on to the next learning objective, which is to understand colonialism as a distinctive kind of political ideology. Notwithstanding Said's distinction between colonialism as practice and imperialism as ideology, European colonialism in the post-Renaissance world became a distinctive kind of political ideology. The economic motive of colonialism gained credence over all its other driving forces as capitalism became inextricably intertwined with colonialism. The variations of colonialism that emerged was a result of the way in which colonies were looked upon as mere sources of raw material to found the flourishing enterprises in the metropolis. This change in the paradigms of colonialism was evidenced by the flack that the drain of wealth from India by the British received from the pioneers among Indian nationalists. Notable in the economic critique of colonialism was Dadabhai Naoroji, who wrote a book, Poverty and the Un-British Rule, that kick-started the intellectual revolution against the British Empire. Highlighting the economic undertones of this political ideology, John Savilian, president of Board of Revenue Madras, stated, and I quote, "Our system acts very much like a sponge, drawing all good things from the banks of Ganges and squeezing them down on the banks of Thames," unquote. This perception of the colonies to provide raw materials for the strengthening of the economies of the colonial powers was not only institutionalized but also created a rigid hierarchy of difference between the colonizer and the colonized, a relationship that was deeply resistant to fair and equitable exchanges, whether economic, cultural, or social. Moving on to the next objective, which is to highlight the theory of colonial discourse and the inequitable relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. The unequal form of intercultural relationship between the colonizer and the colonized referred to earlier was further strengthened in colonies where the subject people were of a different race or where indigenous people existed in a minority. This has been very well rendered by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin in these words, I quote, "The idea of the colonial world became one of a people intrinsically inferior, not just outside history and civilization, but genetically predetermined to inferiority. This subjection was not just a matter of profit and convenience, but also could be constructed as a natural state. The idea of the evolution of mankind and the survival of the fittest race in the crude application of social Darwinism went hand in hand with the doctrines of imperialism that evolved at the end of the 19th century. This rigid hierarchy of difference between the colonizer and the colonized was further cemented by the doctrine of social Darwinism, a product of late 19th century European economic and political expansion. The Englishman most associated with social Darwinism was the sociologist Herbert Spencer. Based on Darwin's theory of natural selection, Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest to describe the outcome of competition between social groups by promulgating that only the best adapted, rather those already at the top of social, economic and political hierarchies, survive the natural contest between social groups. Popular in the 19th and 20th centuries and embraced by the Nazis, it precedes the publication of Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, 1859. Darwin did not address human evolution in his study, The Origin of Species. He focused on the evolution of plants and animals and applied his theories of natural selection specifically to people in The Descent of Man, 1871, a work that critics interpret as justifying cruel social policies at home and imperialism abroad. It was Herbert Spencer who asserted that all aspects of life, be they human, animal or plant life, were guided by constant struggle in which the weak were subjugated by the strong. Social Darwinism was thus used to justify conservative economic and social policies, imperialism and racism, as it provided a scientific justification to the political leaders who sought to preserve the status quo. However, the offshoots of social Darwinism were Eurocentrism and universalism. Now, these two terms need some explanation. I begin with Eurocentrism. The term Eurocentrism denotes a worldview which implicitly or explicitly posits European history and values as normal and superior to others, thereby helping to produce and justify Europe's dominant position within the global capitalist world system. By the 18th century, this conception of Europe as superior as against the rest of the world's cultures had become firmly established through the imperial displays of power, both in the metropolis and at the colonial peripheries. That European systems and values were inherently superior to indigenous ones was further consolidated through the assertions of intellectual authority in colonialist institutions, civil service and legal codes. Edward Said's Orientalism examines the ways in which Eurocentrism not only influences and alters but actually produces other cultures. Orientalism, according to Said, is, I quote, the Western style for dominating, restructuring and having authority over the Orient, unquote. And this authority, he goes on to say, is a product of a systematic discipline by which European culture was able to construct and manage the Orient during the post-Enlightenment period. It is pertinent to mention Gayatri Spivak at this point and her coinage of the term othering, which she uses for the process by which imperial discourse creates its others. The other, according to her, is the excluded or the mastered subject created by the discourse of power. Othering describes the various ways and means by which colonial discourse produces its subjects. She goes on to define it as a dialectical process as the colonizing other with a capital O is produced and established simultaneously as its colonized others with a small o are produced as subjects. The second term that needs some explanation is universalism. Universalism is a hegemonic view of existence where the values and experiences of a dominant culture are regarded to be true for all humanity. Its disregard for cultural difference necessarily links it with imperial hegemony, and its notion of common humanity asserted by the colonizers carries the undertones of the imperial discourse to portray it as the instrument for the progression of the colonized. One of the striking examples of this phenomenon is the link between universality and the canon of texts that represent English literature, a link that has been well illustrated by Gauri Viswanathan. I quote, "It was the power of this discourse to present the English subject as both attractive and universal that rendered it such an effective tool of socio-political control in India in the 19th century and in other colonies in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it is the resilience of this notion of the universal that has maintained a cultural hegemony long after independence throughout the post-colonial world." Unquote. She affirms that literary studies was used to reinforce the British rule in India. A colonized child's memorizing English literary passages is a kind of indoctrination. I quote, "The very recitation of a literary text becomes a ritual act of obedience." Unquote. How this discourse of universalism serves to camouflage the extensive exploitation of the colonized has been well illustrated by Alan Bishop, who states that even the discourse of mathematics is actually a culturally determined mode of imperialist discourse. He argues, I quote, "Wherever you are in the world, the degrees in a triangle add up to 180. But where do degrees come from? Why is the total 180? Why not 200 or 100? Indeed, why are we interested in triangles and their properties at all? The answer to all these questions is essentially because some people determined it should be that way. Mathematical ideas, like any other ideas, are humanly constructed. They have a cultural history." Unquote. Political and moral philosophers in the Western tradition have long wrestled with the legitimacy of colonialism. In fact, political theorists have found it difficult to reconcile with ideas about justice and natural law and the practice of European sovereignty over non-Western peoples. In the 19th century, the tension between liberal thought and colonial practice deepened as dominion of Europe over the rest of the world reached its zenith. Ironically, in the same period when most political philosophers began to defend the principles of universalism and equality, the same individuals still defended the legitimacy of colonialism and imperialism. One way of reconciling those diametrically opposed principles was the argument known as the civilizing mission, which suggested that a temporary period of political dependence or tutelage was necessary for uncivilized societies to advance to the point where they would be capable of sustaining liberal institutions and self-government. For example, according to J.S. Mill, I quote, "Savages do not have the capacity for self-government because of their excessive love of freedom. Serfs, slaves, and peasants in barbarous societies, on the other hand, may be so schooled in obedience that the capacity for rationality is stifled." Unquote. Similarly, Marx rationalizes colonialism as a progressive force modernizing a backward feudal society. The benefits of British colonialism, according to Marx, more than compensated for its violence and injustice. Whatever may have been the crimes of England, he argues, she was the unconscious tool which raised India from a semi-barbaric state into the improved condition of modernity. As a result of these justifications, colonization came to be portrayed, rather represented, as a necessary civilizing endeavor, and its essentially unjust and violent processes were obscured behind a liberal mask of civilizing mission and paternalistic framework. Nevertheless, the injustices of colonialism have been marked by post-structuralists like Derrida and Foucault, who, though not directly associated with colonialism, indirectly suggested that the structure of Western rationality is racist and imperialist. In one of his early essays, Foucault equates European knowledge and the mirage of Western rationality with the economic domination and political hegemony of colonialism. I take up the next learning objective, which is to understand European literary texts as narratives of the damaging discourse of colonial ideology. The negative construction of the colonized and the portrayal of the imperialist processes as necessary and benevolent remained important features of European literary texts. In fact, literary texts were made to supplement the damaging discourse of colonial ideology. For example, Rider Haggard, in her novel King Solomon's Mines, 1885, portrays the African character, I quote, as an ugly savage screaming with gleaming teeth and looking at the reassuring presence of his white master, or else a subhuman crook lurking in the darkness to ungratefully harm his white benefactor, unquote. Similarly, Elspeth Huxley, in her novel Red Strangers, presents her African character somewhat similar to the prehistoric man who has no will whatsoever to change the scheme of things. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness was published in 1902. Now, this was a period of the scramble of Africa when the British projected themselves as superior and Africa as the center of evil, possessed of demonic darkness or barbarism represented by slavery, human sacrifice, and cannibalism. In the novel, the place Congo, where Heart of Darkness is mostly situated, is presented as primitive, a place that lags almost 2,000 years behind Europe. Africa is portrayed by Conrad as a primeval jungle and a place where the European mind disintegrates and regresses into a primitive state. Thus, Africa, India, and other alien lands produce nothing but madness. They are madness itself. In A.M. Foster's A Passage to India, 1924, the two British women, Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested, pay a price for leaving their familiar trajectory and suffer unsettling experiences in India. Another familiar text that could be cited is Shakespeare's The Tempest. Here, Caliban, the original owner of the island, is depicted as a monster, a potential rapist and a thing of darkness, a creature less than human. The issue is not merely the racism of these texts, but how such representations are also a part of a network of power relations aimed, in part, at convincing the colonized subject that Western culture is the civilized norm. Homi K. Bhabha, in The Location of Culture, writes about the way in which colonial subjects are represented as racial stereotypes. Invariably, they are represented as degenerate or inferior, and this kind of representation becomes a justification for the implementation of colonial rule. Daniel Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe is about a man shipwrecked on an island who, being the only survivor, fends for himself, making the best use of what he can salvage from the wreck and of the resources available on the island. During the course of his long stay on the island, he rescues a savage from cannibals whom he later names Friday. Friday becomes Crusoe's companion and servant on the island. Crusoe is therefore seen as the discoverer and colonizer of the island. He longs for human company, but in Friday he finds a savage whom he must civilize by teaching him the English language and Christian morality. The hierarchical relationship between the two is reinforced by Friday calling Crusoe master. Similarly, with the aid of his magic, Prospero in The Tempest frees the spirits and keeps Caliban in his service, having taught him his language so that he can obey orders. Prospero's control over the island and its original inhabitants like Ariel and Caliban can be seen as another narrative of colonization. The important point to note here is that Crusoe and Prospero teach their language to the savages they control. In the light of all this, one can't but agree with Edward Said, for whom Orientalism, the Western discourse about the Orient, has traditionally and invariably served the hegemonic purposes of the West. I quote from Hans Burton's literary theory, The Basics. The inferiority that Orientalism attributes to the East simultaneously serves to construct the West's superiority. The sensuality, irrationality, primitiveness, and despotism of the East constructs the West as rational, democratic, progressive, and so on. The West always functions as the center and the East is a marginal other. I move on to the last learning objective of this lecture, which is to highlight the continuing presence of colonialism in the garb of neocolonialism. However, the granting of cultural self-definition and political self-determination to its colonies did not evolve out of a blend of European post-colonial guilt and its policy of enlightenment. Such an inference or reading, needless to say, is part of the construction of the ideology of late 19th century imperialism. Freedom from the colonial system was the product of a considerable internal struggle for cultural and political self-determination on part of the colonized. In the words of Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin, I quote, "British India and European African colonies had to engage in a long and frequently bloody process of dissent, protest, and rebellion to secure their independence," unquote. In fact, the rise of nationalism and the waging of independence campaigns in various colonies, coupled with the new domestic priorities in the post-war period for colonial rulers, could be slated as the reasons for colonialism to have come to an end. Arguably, one could say that colonialism is still on. Far from disappearing, it seems to have modified and developed into the neocolonialism of the post-independence period. Jean Baudrillard points out that colonization does not happen from outside the society. A version of it can arise from within also. The indigenous middle class that runs the government of the newly independent countries is not much different from the European masters. This class is neo-colonial. It continues to exploit the people. For example, Chinua Acheb's novel Ant Hills of the Savannah, 1987, is a critique of the failure of African political leadership, cognizant that such leaders often blame the West to excuse their own failings. Rushdie's Midnight Children is a novel about India's failure to live up to its political aspirations proclaimed by Nehru at independence. The essence of neocolonialism is that the country which has achieved technical independence continues to have its political policy and economic system controlled either by the ex-colonial powers or else the superpower, the United States. This neocolonial control was exercised through international monetary bodies, multinational corporations, and educational and cultural institutions. Margaret Atwood, in her Surfacing, delineates and combats the relationship between America-led capitalism and ecological devastation in Canada, as well as debating Canadian national identity. However, recently, the international institutions used by the developed nations in general and USA in particular as instruments of hegemony are now being undermined with a shift in power dynamics at the global level. USA has backed out of multilateral agreements and intergovernmental organizations as it perceives such obligations to be detrimental to its interests and thereby has put the onus of compliance on developing nations. Another manifestation of this recent spurt in neo-colonialist propensities is the subtle undermining of the international rule-based order by China in the garb of One Belt, One Road initiative around the world in general and string of pearls in Asia in particular. It has invested in commercial and military facilities and bases respectively in different countries. These initiatives are funded through 100 years leasing agreements and other forms of hard loans. Often due to economic upheavals in these countries, either the leasing period is extended or else the country runs the risk of financial instability. Therefore, economic assistance given by China to further its propaganda of military aggression and expansion has paved the way for well-founded fears of revival of colonialism, or, as it is called in the present time, neo-colonialism. This is where I end my lecture on colonialism. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Meet you, inshallah, next time. Till then, take care.